The moment she stepped into the cockpit, the pilots couldn't help but chuckle. She was young, barely out of her teens, wearing a flight suit that seemed almost too big for her frame. "I'm Falcon," she said, her voice calm but firm. One of the senior pilots leaned back, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Falcon? That's cute," he muttered, thinking it was just another nickname, another rookie trying to sound tough. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet intensity that made him pause for just a second. Not long enough to change his judgment, not yet. The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight chatter. Co-pilots double-checked instruments. The radio crackled with routine traffic updates, and the passengers settled into their seats, oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold. Outside, the runway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of steel under the early morning sun. Everything looked ordinary, everything seemed safe, and yet, beneath the calm, an invisible tension hummed in the air, as if the plane itself knew something was coming. Falcon ran through her checklist with methodical precision. Every switch, every gauge, every lever received the attention of someone who had spent countless hours memorizing the dance between machine and sky. The pilots watched, still smirking, still thinking this was just a girl with a big imagination, but then her hand hovered over the throttle, her eyes scanning the horizon, and a shiver ran through the cockpit. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. She knew something they did in single quotes. The engines roared to life, a deep, vibrating growl that filled the cabin. Falcon adjusted the controls with a grace that seemed effortless, guiding the massive aircraft down the runway. Passengers clutched their armrests as the plane lifted off, rising into the clouds with a speed that left a few mouths open in awe. "See," one of the pilots whispered, trying to reassure himself. "She's just lucky." But luck doesn't explain instinct, and instinct was what Falcon had in spades. Minutes into the flight, the radio suddenly crackled. At first it was just static, the usual background noise in the high-altitude cabin. Then her voice came through, calm yet commanding, cutting through the interference. "Attention, control tower, this is Falcon. Engines are showing abnormal readings." The words were simple, almost casual, but the weight behind them made the pilots stiffen. They glanced at each other, the smirk fading, replaced by something closer to unease. The first explosion was subtle, more of a jolt than a bang. One engine coughed, a brief fireball licking the side of the fuselage, and then everything seemed normal again. Falcon's hands never wavered. She corrected the course, adjusted the throttle, and spoke into the radio again, her voice steady but sharp. "Repeat, engine 1 is failing. Prepare for emergency protocol." The pilots looked at her in disbelief. The same girl they had laughed at was now orchestrating a crisis with a calmness that defied explanation. Passengers began to murmur, sensing the shift in energy, but none of them could understand the magnitude of what was happening. Falcon's eyes scanned the instruments like a hawk. Each flicker of a light, each variation in pressure, she read it all, translating it into actions before the alarms could even sound. The second engine hesitated, shuddered, and then the explosion tore through the cabin with a force that made everyone gasp. Oxygen masks dropped, the plane pitched violently, and for a moment, it seemed like chaos had won. Yet through it all, Falcon's voice cracked not in fear, but in sheer determination. She barked instructions into the radio, her commands precise, cutting through the panic. "Control tower, this is Falcon. We're losing both engines. We need immediate guidance. I repeat, both engines failing." The pilots, once full of doubt, now stared at her with wide eyes, their own hands frozen over the controls. They had flown thousands of hours, faced turbulence, storms, and emergencies, but never had they encountered someone like her. Somewhere in the back of the cabin, a young mother clutched her child, feeling the plane shudder and sway, and wondered if they would make it. A businessman in the front row pressed his forehead against the window, watching clouds blur into streaks of white, praying silently. And above them all, Falcon kept working, a living bridge between disaster and survival, guiding the plane through impossible odds with nothing but skill, instinct, and courage. The radio continued to crackle, the words a lifeline to the outside world. "Falcon, can you maintain altitude?" the control tower asked, their voice tense. Falcon's reply was calm, almost chilling in its steadiness. "I'm holding, but we're running out of options. I need guidance, now." The gravity of the situation pressed down on everyone in the cabin. This wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a test of will, of nerve, of every ounce of knowledge Falcon had accumulated. And then it happened, a moment so brief, yet so terrifying, that it would be burned into the memory of everyone aboard. The plane shuddered violently, alarms blaring in a chorus of panic. The cabin lights flickered, throwing shadows across anxious faces. Falcon gritted her teeth, eyes fixed on the panel, hands moving with precision that no one else could match. The pilots who had doubted her mere minutes ago now followed her lead like students in a masterclass of survival. Outside, the sky was a vast, indifferent blue. Clouds swirled around the plane, teasing at turbulence. The sun reflected off the wings in a cruel mockery of serenity. Inside, fear, determination, and disbelief collided in every passenger's chest. Falcon's voice rose again, cutting through the roar of the engines and the panic in the cabin. "Control tower, we are not going down today. I repeat, we are not going down." It was impossible to tell if the plane would make it. Every second stretched into eternity. Every heartbeat seemed to echo in the silence between explosions. The pilots exchanged a look, a mixture of awe and terror. This young woman, whom they had dismissed with laughter, was now the only reason the plane had a chance. And yet, despite all her skill and bravery, the outcome remained uncertain. One wrong move, one failed system, and the sky that had seemed so beautiful and limitless would turn into a trap dot in that moment. The world narrowed to a single point: the cockpit, the control panel, and Falcon. She had claimed a name, a title, and now she carried the responsibility of everyone on board. Laughter was gone. Doubt had been replaced with a fragile trust. And as the engines roared and groaned under impossible stress, one question hung in the air. Could she really keep the plane and everyone in Italy? And just as the cabin seemed to find a moment of fragile stability, another jolt rattled the plane, louder than anything before. Oxygen masks hung like fragile lifelines, passengers held their breath, and Falcon's voice, though steady, carried the weight of an impossible challenge. "Brace yourselves," she said, her words cutting through the fear. "We're not done yet." The cockpit was tense. The radio crackled. Outside, the sky waited silently. And in that suspended moment, one thing was certain. No one on that flight, not even the seasoned pilots, would ever forget the name she had given them: Falcon. Falcon's hands never stopped moving. Every flick of a switch, every subtle adjustment of the throttle, seemed instinctive, almost like a dance she had practiced thousands of times. But no one aboard this flight knew her story, not yet. The passengers, wide-eyed and gripping their seats, only saw a girl who had somehow stepped into the impossible. The pilots, meanwhile, sat frozen between awe and disbelief, slowly realizing that this was not just skill. This was something far beyond ordinary. She had always been called Falcon, though that wasn't her birth name. It had been a title given long ago by someone who recognized something in her others never did: a sharpness, an instinct, a way of seeing the world that bordered on preternatural. Most people would have laughed, dismissing a child's fantasies, but she had earned it. From the earliest moments she had spent in flight simulators, she had moved through crises with an understanding that textbooks couldn't teach. Every emergency scenario, every simulation, every challenge she had faced had been a lesson not in technique, but in intuition. Her journey to this cockpit had not been easy. The world of aviation was dominated by experience, seniority, and a network that seemed almost impossible for someone like her to penetrate. At 12, she had been dismissed. At 15, underestimated. At 18, nearly ignored. Each time the laughter followed, the smirks of those who believed in years rather than talent, until she learned to let it roll off her back. And now, at a moment when every second mattered, that same laughter had vanished, replaced by urgent reliance. The plane jolted again, and Falcon's eyes flicked to the instruments. Smoke trailed from the first engine, a thin gray line curling upward, disappearing into the fuselage. She tightened her grip on the controls, feeling every vibration, every pulse through her fingertips. Her mind moved faster than the plane itself, calculating, predicting, adjusting. She wasn't just reacting, she was anticipating. She could feel the stress on the metal, the strain in the hydraulics, the subtle shift in airflow. The senior pilot, whose name was Lieutenant Harris, cleared his throat. "I've flown a lot of things," he said, his voice tight, "but I've never seen someone handle this with this composure." He glanced at the co-pilot, a younger man named Daniels, who shook his head, almost as if to say, "I don't understand it either. It's like she knows the plane better than we do." Falcon didn't answer him directly. Her eyes stayed locked on the panels. Her voice focused on the radio. "Control tower, we have a situation. Engine 1 and 2 are critically damaged. Altitude holding is difficult. Recommend emergency procedures and possible reroute." She spoke with a calm urgency that carried weight, each word precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Her voice, though young, had the authority of someone who had seen disaster up close and refused to blink. Below, the landscape stretched endlessly. Rivers wound like silver ribbons between dark forests. Small towns dotted the land, and highways snaked their way through fields that glimmered in the sun. Passengers pressed faces against windows, seeking comfort in familiar sights, but the beauty outside offered no solace. The plane's groaning wings, the violent pitch, the smell of burning metal inside, the reality of danger pressed harder than the serene landscape could soothe. Falcon remembered a lesson her mentor had once told her, years before she ever stepped into a real cockpit. "A pilot isn't just someone who knows the plane," he had said. "A pilot is someone who listens to the machine, to the sky, to themselves. And when all else fails, they trust the voice inside that tells them the right move, even when everything else screams no." She had carried that lesson into every flight simulation, every test, every trial. And now, as smoke curled from the engine and alarms screamed, that inner voice guided her hands. The co-pilot tried to break the tension. "You're incredible," he said quietly, almost to himself. I've never." His words cut off as the plane shuddered violently again, throwing everyone against their restraints. Falcon adjusted her grip, her knuckles white, her eyes narrowing. "Keep calm," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "We are not done yet." Meanwhile, the passengers had begun to notice more than just the chaos. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some noticed her age, some the fearlessness in her posture, others the intensity in her eyes. A man near the front muttered, "Who is she? How does she know what she's doing?" A woman beside him gripped her child tightly, nodding as if to reassure both herself and her son. No one had the answers. Yet a fragile hope began to thread through the cabin. It was impossible, yet somehow, with her at the helm, survival didn't feel entirely out of reach. Back in the cockpit, Falcon's mind raced. She had trained for mechanical failure, weather turbulence, and human error, but nothing had ever fully prepared her for simultaneous catastrophic engine failure at cruising altitude. Her fingers moved over the controls instinctively, toggling switches, rerouting hydraulics, monitoring pressure valves. Each decision had to be perfect. A single misstep could cost lives. And yet, there was a strange clarity in the chaos, a rhythm she could follow if she stayed calm. Harris swallowed hard. "Do you ever doubt yourself?" he asked, almost rhetorically. Falcon didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the throttle slightly, feeling the subtle vibrations through the fuselage, measuring how the plane responded. "I doubt every second," she admitted finally, her voice low but steady. "But doubt doesn't help. Action does." The plane groaned again, louder this time. Smoke from the engines was now visible through the small windows in the fuselage, curling like dark fingers reaching for the sky. Falcon's heart pounded in rhythm with the warning sirens, but her mind remained raised. She had always believed that fear was a tool, not a weakness. It sharpened focus. It revealed possibilities. Panic, on the other hand, could be deadly. She couldn't afford panic. Not now. Not ever. The control tower's voice crackled back over the radio, urgent, but calm. "Falcon, do you have a preferred route? Can you maintain altitude for reroute instructions?" Falcon inhaled, processing the data. The plane was straining. Holding altitude was possible, but only if she balanced throttle and glide perfectly. "I can maintain for now," she replied, "but we need a clear path. Minimal altitude change. I repeat, minimal altitude change. Any deviation could worsen the engine stress." Her words were meticulous, measured, precise. As she spoke, her mind wandered briefly, not out of distraction, but calculation. She remembered her first solo flight, when the wind had caught her off guard and nearly flipped the plane in the early morning air. That terror had felt overwhelming, paralyzing, but it had taught her something critical. Preparation mattered, but adaptability mattered more. And now, adaptability was all that stood between them and disaster. The pilots watched, still in awe, still grappling with disbelief. Daniels, the co-pilot, finally broke his silence. How is she so calm?" he muttered. Harris didn't answer. He couldn't. Words wouldn't capture it. There was something about Falcon, something beyond training, beyond skill, beyond human expectation. It was as if she had anticipated this moment her entire life, as if the chaos around her was just another variable in a world she had long understood. Outside, the sky darkened slightly as clouds gathered. Turbulence threatened to toss the plane again, but Falcon adjusted, guiding the aircraft through every invisible current with meticulous precision. Passengers clutched seatbacks, whispered prayers, and tried to remain calm. Some closed their eyes, hoping the nightmare would pass. But deep down, everyone knew this was far from over. And then came the first sign that this crisis wasn't merely mechanical. Falcon noticed it before anyone else's. Subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, but different from engine failure. It was the tail, shifting slightly, responding strangely to her inputs. Something was wrong, something no simulation had prepared her for. Her stomach tightened, and for the first time, the quiet hum of instinct was accompanied by a sharp edge of unease. She tightened her grip and spoke into the radio once more. "Control tower, we may have structural issues. Engine failure may not be the only concern. I repeat, possible tail instability. Advise." The pilots exchanged worried glances. Harris's hand hovered over the intercom, ready to shout instructions, but something in Falcon's composure made him hesitate. Daniels leaned closer to the instruments, squinting at the subtle fluctuations she had noticed. "She's right," he whispered. "We're not just fighting engines. Something else is wrong." The passengers, still unaware of the technical details, sensed only the growing tension. Murmurs spread through the cabin. Some prayed, some clutched loved ones, others stared at Falcon's back, at the comm control in the middle of chaos, wondering how one person could carry the fate of everyone aboard. Falcon's eyes flicked to the horizon, searching for anything that could guide her. A patch of open sky, a clearing in the clouds, a chance to stabilize the aircraft. She knew every second counted. One miscalculation, one missed detail, and the fragile thread of survival could snap. Her voice, steady yet urgent, cut through the cockpit and into the cabin. "Everyone, remain calm. Stay seated. Do not panic. Trust that we will find a way." For a moment, the world seemed suspended. Engines hissed. The fuselage groaned, and outside, the sky waited, indifferent, as if holding its breath. And in that suspended moment, one undeniable truth emerged. Falcon was no ordinary pilot. She was something else entirely, a force that defied expectation, a presence that commanded attention, and a mystery that had yet to reveal its full scope. The plane groaned again, pitching violently as turbulence ripped through the clouds. Every passenger felt it like a living thing flexing against them, reminding them that they were at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. In the cockpit, Falcon's hands moved almost automatically, compensating for shifts, balancing the throttles, nudging the plane back into a semblance of stability. Her eyes flicked to the instruments constantly. Every gauge, every light, a story in itself. She didn't speak much now. Action had become language. Down in the cabin, the passengers were a mix of fear and fascination. Some whispered to each other, speculating about who this girl was. She must be a prodigy, one man said, though his voice trembled. There's no other explanation. Across the aisle, a teenage girl clutched her phone, pretending to text, but she was really recording Falcon's calm determination, capturing the improbable hero in real time. Parents held their children closer, trying to shield them from the panic in their own hearts, hoping their presence would somehow provide comfort. Meanwhile, a small subplot had begun to emerge in the minds of a few passengers. Questions that had nothing to do with engines or altitudes. A businessman, sitting near the front, wondered aloud why the airline had allowed someone so young in the cockpit. Are we even insured? He muttered under his breath. Beside him, a woman shook her head, thinking less about policy and more about courage. I don't care about insurance, she whispered. Right now, she's the only reason we might make it. In the cockpit, the senior pilots tried to reconcile what was happening with everything they had been trained to expect. Harris had been flying for over 20 years. He had survived storms that flattened visibility, engines that sputtered mid-flight, and moments of near panic from inexperienced passengers, but nothing like this. The way Falcon managed the plane, the decisions she made instinctively, it didn't fit into any protocol. He wondered briefly if experience alone had been overrated, if instinct could actually surpass everything else. Daniel, as the younger co-pilot, was still watching Falcon with a mixture of fear and admiration. He had learned all the textbook responses, the emergency procedures, and the sequence of steps to stabilize a failing plane, but nothing in any manual PR. Peppered him for the complexity of what Falcon was handling. His eyes darted between her and the instruments, trying to catch the next sign of danger, ready to intervene, but knowing he might not have the chance before she acted. Outside, the world was indifferent. Clouds churned like waves, shadows flickered over the fuselage, and lightning flashed faintly in the distance. The plane groaned under the strain, the engine sputtering as if pleading for mercy. Falcon's attention, however, was more than mechanical. It was strategic. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating how the remaining power could be redistributed, how altitude could be maintained long enough to reach safer airspace. Every decision carried enormous weight. One wrong move and catastrophe would follow. In the cabin, passengers began noticing other small but unnerving signs: the faint smell of smoke, the trembling panels overhead, the occasional flash of orange reflected in a window. Some tried to distract themselves with prayer, others with whispered conversations, but the tension was palpable. Every few minutes, a jolt would ripple through the plane, and every heart would skip a beat. The collective fear created an invisible pressure, as if the plane itself could sense the anxiety. Among the passengers, a young journalist was quietly observing everything. She had a camera in her lap, untouched, and a notebook open on her tray table. Her mind raced with questions. Who was Falcon really? How had she come to be in this cockpit? Was this a prodigy, a trained expert, or something even stranger? Every detail Falcon revealed through her precise, urgent commands was a clue to a larger story, and the journalist knew this was the story of a lifetime. She scribbled notes feverishly, her eyes darting between Falcon's calm form and the terrified passengers around her. Meanwhile, Falcon's thoughts were split. She had to manage the plane, yes, but she also had to anticipate human reaction. Panic, after all, could spread faster than fire through the cabin. She called out calmly to the passengers over the intercom, "Remain seated, fasten your seatbelts, stay focused on keeping calm. Everything we do together now will help us through this." Her voice carried authority, but it was not commanding in the way most adults would speak. There was a subtle empathy in it, a human understanding that resonated with everyone listening. But just as tension seemed to settle into a fragile rhythm, another problem appeared. Falcon noticed a faint but distinct vibration in the tail of the plane. It was not like the engine issues. This was different, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her pause for a fraction of a second, the only fraction she could afford. "Control tower," she said, voice measured but urgent. "Possible structural stress in the tail. Recommend immediate assessment if possible." Harris looked over, eyes wide. "Structural? Are you saying the fuselage might he didn't finish?" Falcon's eyes never left the instruments. "I'm saying we can't ignore this," she replied. "Every movement from here on must be precise. One wrong adjustment, and the whole tail assembly could fail." Passengers had begun murmuring in fear again. A man in the back row whispered to his wife, "Do you think she can handle it?" The woman didn't answer. She could only watch, hoping that the young pilot's composure wasn't a mask over desperation. Others scanned the cabin, eyes wide, trying to understand how someone so young could be in control of their lives, holding them over an abyss they could barely imagine. At the same time, A flight attendant moved down the aisle, attempting to calm passengers. Her own fear carefully masked behind a professional smile. She encouraged people to keep masks on, belts fastened, and voices quiet. But she herself was struggling to process the situation. She had been trained for emergencies, yes, but she had never witnessed someone commanding a failing plane with the instinctual precision Falcon displayed. Meanwhile, was calculating the next steps. The smoke in the engine suggested imminent failure, if not already critical. The subtle vibration in the tail could signal serious structural compromise. She had to keep altitude, minimize stress on the fuselage, and navigate toward potential landing options. But the plane's systems were failing faster than she could monitor them. Her brain moved at double speed, compartmentalizing problems, prioritizing, executing, anticipating. Every second counted. Every second was survival. In the background, the radio crackled with the control tower's voice. Falcon, we're monitoring your situation. You need to identify a safe corridor. Altitude adjustments recommended to reduce stress on the airframe. Falcon's reply was quick, concise, but carried the weight of every life aboard. Roger, attempting minimal adjustments to stabilize flight, prioritizing tail integrity and remaining thrust. Repeat, every move calculated for stability and safety. Meanwhile, the passengers' stories unfolded in parallel. A young boy leaned over his mother's shoulder, wide-eyed, whispering, "Mom, she's like a superhero." The mother nodded, unsure how to respond. The words stuck somewhere between awe and fear. Another man, a retired engineer, quietly examined the situation from a technical angle, analyzing what he could infer about the plane's behavior and Falcon's responses. He shook his head in disbelief. "I've read manuals for decades," he muttered to himself. "But nothing teaches this. Nothing explains this." In the cockpit, Daniels's hands shook slightly as he reached for a control. "Should I?" he began. Harris held up a hand, shaking his head. "No, just follow her lead. She knows." Daniels swallowed hard, letting his fear mingle with reluctant trust. He had trained for emergencies, but he had never faced someone whose intuition seemed to rewrite the rules in real time. As clouds thickened outside, lightning illuminated the sky, casting fleeting shadows across the cabin. The plane's metal shivered under the stress of invisible currents. Falcon adjusted, nudging, compensating, anticipating. Every eye in the cabin tracked her, every heartbeat synced unconsciously to hers. And yet, the larger question remained unresolved. With engines failing, a possible structural problem in the tail, and the turbulence worsening, could they truly survive the next crucial minutes? The tension was unbearable, thickening like the clouds outside. Everyone aboard was caught in a web of fear, hope, and the sheer unknown. Falcons.com was the only constant, but even she knew that calm was fragile, dependent on every correct decision and every remaining ounce of strength. The passengers, the crew, even the pilots, all were dependent on this one extraordinary individual. And as the plane pitched again, smoke trailing more visibly now, it became clear, nothing about this flight was ordinary. And the story of Falcon was far from over. The plane shuddered violently, a sudden lurch that threw passengers forward and rattled the overhead bins. Falcon's hands gripped the controls tighter, her knuckles white, eyes scanning every flicker of warning lights, every gauge, every movement of the trembling aircraft. Outside, clouds churned like boiling water, shadows darkened foreboding, lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark bursts, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Passengers gasped collectively, clutching seatbacks in one another, the sense of imminent danger settling in with crushing weight. The young journalist in the back row scribbled notes frantically, but her hands shook as her eyes darted between Falcon's unshakable focus and the panic around her. Some whispered prayers, some held their children tighter, some stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, waiting for what might come next. The fear was electric, contagious, and unavoidable. In the cockpit, Harris and Daniels were silent, watching Falcon like pupils in awe of a teacher who had suddenly become a lifeline. Every instinct they had honed over decades was now secondary to hers. She's predicting it, Daniels muttered under his breath. Every jolt, every vibration, she knows it before it happens. Harris nodded slowly, a cold realization settling over him. Experience mattered, training mattered, but in this moment, they were witnesses to something extraordinary. Falcon's mind moved faster than the plane itself. The engines were failing more rapidly now, their sputters and groans louder, closer, each vibration a warning. The faint but persistent tremor in the tail had grown, subtle flexing that suggested structural stress. She calculated in fractions of seconds, rerouting power where possible, balancing the throttle, adjusting the plane's pitch, all while listening to the crackling radio and monitoring the panic in the cabin. The radio crackled urgently. "Falcon, we are tracking your position. You need to make a decision: immediate emergency landing, or risk further altitude loss. Advise." Falcon's jaw tightened. She knew that decision could not be rushed, yet the clock was merciless. "Control tower," she replied, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "We cannot descend rapidly. Engines are failing. Structural integrity is compromised. We need a calculated approach, not a sudden drop." Her words hung in the air like a fragile promise, but inside, every second felt like a countdown. The turbulence worsened. The plane pitched sharply, throwing luggage from the overhead bins and sending oxygen masks swinging violently. Falcon adjusted, countered, recalibrated. Each movement was precise, necessary, but the stress on the airframe was undeniable. Harris swallowed hard. If that tail gives way, we're finished, he said quietly, almost to himself. Daniels leaned closer, eyes wide, silently praying that Falcon's instincts would hold Dot back in the cabin. The passengers were on the edge of panic. A woman clasped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming silently. A man whispered encouragement to his children, though his own voice trembled. The young journalist recorded, documenting the unfolding drama. Every word of Falcon's comm commands a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. Everyone knew the magnitude of what was happening, even if they couldn't understand the technical details. This was survival, hanging by a thread. Falcon's mind briefly flashed back to the early hours of her training. The long nights spent studying aircraft behavior, the countless simulations of engine failure and mechanical stress, all of that preparation had led to this moment. She felt a flash of doubt, a momentary flicker of fear, but she swallowed it immediately. Doubt could paralyze, fear could destroy. She didn't have the luxury of either. Every decision, every adjustment, every breath was critical. The tail vibration worsened, a subtle but growing flex that made Falcon pause for a fraction of a second, long enough for Daniels to notice. Falcon, the tail, he started. She cut him off. I know, she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Every second counts. We cannot panic. We hold, we calculate, we survive. Her words were not just commands, they were reassurance, a tether to sanity for the crew and passengers alike. The plane groaned again, louder this time. Smoke from the engines thickened, curling ominously. Sparks flickered faintly near one of the turbines, and the subtle smell of burning metal reached the cabin. Panic threatened to rise, but Falcon's calm persisted like a shield, holding the chaos at bay. The pilots had become extensions of her will, following her lead without hesitation. The passengers clung to hope, fragile but real. Because she had made it so, lightning struck nearby, illuminating the clouds in jagged brilliance. Falcon adjusted the controls, holding the plane against the invisible forces that sought to tear it apart. Every movement required more precision, every adjustment, more calculation. She could feel the strain in her arms, the tension in her back, but she did not allow it to show. To falter, even for a second, could mean catastrophe. Daniels glanced at Harris, eyes wide. She's pushing it. The engines won't hold much longer. Harris nodded grimly, but neither spoke further. Words were useless now. Only action mattered. Falcon was thinking 2, 3, 4 steps ahead, already calculating potential outcomes that no one else could anticipate. The control tower's voice returned, crackling over the radio. Falcon, immediate decision needed. Do you have a landing option? She exhaled slowly, measuring the risk. Negative, she replied. All nearby airstrips compromised or inaccessible. We maintain current altitude as long as possible. Prepare for emergency protocol. Every move calculated for survival. Passengers whispered among themselves, the sense of impending doom growing heavier. A mother held her children close, her heart hammering. An elderly man muttered a silent prayer, eyes closed tightly. The young journalist's hands shook as she recorded, documenting the tension, the fear, the improbable heroism of a young pilot named Falcon. Everyone knew, without fully understanding, that they were on the edge of something unprecedented. Suddenly, a loud metallic groan echoed through the fuselage. Falcon froze for a heartbeat, eyes narrowing at the instruments. The tail's subtle vibration had escalated into a threatening resonance. She adjusted instinctively, rerouting remaining engine power, but the plane shuddered violently, jerking sideways. Oxygen masks swayed, passengers screamed involuntarily, and the journalist's pen froze mid-note. Falcon's voice cut through the chaos. Calm but commanding. Brace for turbulence. Hold position. Trust the calculations. Do not move from your seats. The words carried authority, empathy, and urgency all at once. The passengers obeyed, some gripping their armrests so tightly that their knuckles whitened. Others clutched loved ones, silently praying that Falcon's instincts would hold. The engine sputtered again, a deep, threatening cough that filled the cockpit and cabin alike. Smoke streaked the fuselage, sparks flew, and every vibration of the plane seemed magnified in the tension-filled air. Falcon adjusted, countered, recalculated. Every motion was a delicate balance, a battle against forces no human should face alone. Harris glanced at Daniels. We've never seen anything handle this. It's unreal. Daniels swallowed hard, gripping the panel. I don't know how she's doing it. I just hope she can keep holding it. Falcon's eyes flicked outside. The clouds churned, the sky darkened, and the faint glimmer of distant terrain barely visible below seemed like a fragile promise. She knew that survival depended on every second, every calculation, and every instinct she had cultivated over years. And yet, even with her skill, the danger pressed closer, the tension building to a crescendo. The cabin rocked violently. Passengers gasped. Some cried. Some closed their eyes. The plane's metal screamed under the strain. Sparks flickered from the engines again, smoke thickened, and the vibration in the tail grew stronger, more ominous. Falcon's hands flew over the controls, adjusting, balancing, compensating. Her voice was steady over the intercom. "Hold tight. Do not panic. We are not done yet." And in that moment, everything seemed to hang by a thread: the engines, the tail, the plane itself. Every passenger, every crew member, every pilot knew that the next minutes could decide everything. Fear and hope collided, uncertainty pressed like a weight, and all eyes were on Falcon, the young pilot who had claimed a name, a plane, and the impossible task of keeping them alive. The world outside was vast and indifferent, but inside, the plane was a storm of human emotion, mental stress, and sheer will. The climax was approaching, every second stretching into eternity, every vibration threatening catastrophe. And as Falcon braced for the next move, for the next jolt, for the unknown that loomed ahead, one truth became clear: the moment of ultimate test was almost upon them, and no one aboard would ever forget the name Falcon, or the flight that had pushed her on to all of them to the very edge. Just as Falcon steadied the plane, balancing it delicately between failing engines and a threatening tail vibration, a new problem emerged, subtle alarm she hadn't expected. It was faint at first, barely audible over the groaning engines and the rush of wind outside, but she caught it immediately. Her heart skipped a beat, not with fear, but with recognition. This was not part of the mechanical failures she had been anticipating. Something else was wrong. Daniels noticed it too. "Falcon, what's that?" he asked, voice tense. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted across the instrument panel, scanning for anomalies. Then her jaw tightened. "Someone is interfering with the navigation systems," she said quietly, almost in disbelief. Harris froze, the realization dawning on him. "Interfering? You mean sabotage?" Falcon didn't reply. Instead, she leaned forward, her hands moving with lightning speed over the remaining functioning controls. The plane had already been stretched to its limits. Now, with the potential of someone or something tampering with their instruments, the stakes escalated beyond survival into a realm she had never fully prepared for. Every decision, every adjustment, now carried a layer of uncertainty that could tip the balance at any moment. In the cabin, passengers had no idea what was happening technically, but they felt the change. The plane shuddered in a way that was different, less natural, more deliberate. The young journalist, sensing something more than a mechanical emergency, turned back toward the cockpit with wide eyes. She whispered to herself, "This isn't just an accident. Something else is going on." Around her, passengers murmured, their unease growing, unaware that a new danger had entered the equation. Falcon's mind raced. Sabotage. Could it be intentional? Malicious? Was this a hidden flaw? A system glitch? Or worse, a deliberate act, targeting the very engines she had fought so hard to stabilize? Her instincts screamed at her to stay calm, to rely on logic and training, but the tension in the cockpit had shifted. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he followed her adjustments, knowing the margin for error had just narrowed even further. Outside, the sky darkened unnaturally as clouds rolled in thicker, faster. Lightning flickered closer, painting the fuselage in staccato bursts. Falcon knew she couldn't rely solely on instruments now. She had to trust her eyes, her intuition, and the rhythm of the plane under her fingertips. The trust she had built with the crew over the last harrowing hours now became vital. Harris nodded to Daniels, both silently acknowledging that every instinct and every decision now counted twice as much. The passengers began to sense that the danger had shifted. It wasn't just turbulence, smoke, or failing engines anymore. Something unseen, intangible, was pressing down on them. A mother held her child tighter, her knuckles white, whispering, "Stay calm, stay calm." A businessman muttered quietly, eyes darting to Falcon's steady form, realizing that the calm in the cockpit might be their only hope. Even the flight attendant, moving down the aisle to reassure passengers, felt the weight of attention she had never trained for. Falcon's voice cut through the intercom, steady and commanding, but with a sharper edge than before. "All crew, be alert. Systems are showing unexpected fluctuations. Remain focused. Every instrument may be compromised. Trust your training, but trust me more. We adjust by sight, by feel, and by instinct until we regain control." Her words carried authority, but also a hint of the extraordinary she was leading them to. True, an invisible battlefield where the rules were changing in real time. Daniels leaned closer to her, voice barely audible. How are we supposed to handle sabotage on top of everything else?" Falcon's eyes didn't leave the instruments. "By staying alive 1 second at a time," she said quietly. "By keeping everyone calm. By reading the plane like a living thing. And by anticipating what's coming next. We don't have the luxury of panic." Outside turbulence intensified. The plane bucked, each movement more violent than before. Sparks flickered from the engines again. Smoke curled thicker into the cabin, and the subtle tail vibration worsened with every jolt. Falcon adjusted, recalibrated, and recalculated. Every decision now carried a multiplier of the failing engines. Structural stress and interference in navigation combined into a single, escalating threat. One wrong move could trigger disaster. Meanwhile, the journalist in the back noticed subtle cues passengers hadn't yet pieced together. The way Falcon moved with extraordinary precision, the flickers of stress that crossed Harris' face, the tension in Daniel's shoulders. She realized this story wasn't just about a young pilot saving a plane from mechanical failure. It was about something far deeper, something that could rewrite how they understood the entire flight. She scribbled faster, aware that the audience for her story, if anyone survived, would never believe what she had witnessed. The control tower crackled again. Tension thick in their voices. Falcon, all instruments are showing interference. Confirm, Ken. You maintain control. Falcon didn't hesitate. Control tower, maintain communication and visibility as much as possible. Instruments may not be reliable. I repeat, all systems are suspect. We proceed by instinct and visual confirmation. Prepare for extreme measures if stability is lost. Harris swallowed hard. Extreme measures? He muttered. Daniel's eyes widened. I think she means whatever it takes to survive. Falcons.com presence hid the adrenaline and focus beneath. She had spent her life preparing for crises, but this was a test that no simulation could replicate. Sabotage on top of failing engines and structural stress meant every action, every breath, and every heartbeat was critical. In the cabin, a murmur ran through passengers. Some whispered about fate, some about luck, some about the young pilot at the helm who seemed impossibly composed. The plane pitched violently again, throwing luggage from the overhead bins and rattling overhead compartments. Falcon's voice cut through the panic, sharp and precise. Brace eyes forward. Trust me. And then, just as the plane leveled slightly, a violent shudder ran through the fuselage, different this time, uneven, almost deliberate. Falcon's eyes widened. The tail vibration, the failing engines, and now something tampering with the plane's guidance systems. It was all converging, pressing the aircraft to a limit that might break it. She tightened her grip, recalculated, and prepared for the next unpredictable jolt. Every passenger felt it, the shift in tension, the invisible hand of danger pressing heavier than ever. Fear was no longer just about engines or turbulence. This was something unknown, something deliberate, something that had changed the rules of survival mid-flight. And as Falcon focused on holding the plane together, on keeping everyone alive, a single truth became undeniable. This flight was no longer just about mechanical failure. It was a battle against unseen forces. And the climax, whatever it would bring, was drawing impossibly close. Falcon felt the plane shudder violently, the tail vibration screaming louder than ever, the engines coughing and groaning under the weight of failure. She knew the final moments were at hand. Every adjustment, every calculation, every decision mattered. The passengers were bracing for the worst, gripping armrests and each other, and she could sense their fear radiating through the cabin. Harris and Daniels followed her lead with precision, hands steady now, minds fully tuned to her instincts. The interference with the navigation systems had created chaos, but Falcon had learned to read the plane, not just the instruments. She switched to manual override, guiding the aircraft by feel, by sight, by intuition. She could see the faint horizon line through the storm clouds, a narrow corridor of light that might be their only chance. Hold tight, she shouted over the intercom. We're stabilizing. Focus on breathing. Trust me. The plane pitched violently again, and a spark erupted from one of the engines, illuminating the cabin in a terrifying orange glow. Falcon's mind raced. The tail structure was under extreme stress. The engines were on the verge of complete failure. But she had one option. She could attempt a controlled descent, using the remaining thrust and aerodynamic control to glide toward the open patch of sky below. One miscalculation, and it would be over. Daniels glanced at her, eyes wide. Falcon, can we make it? She didn't answer directly. Her eyes never left the controls. We have to, she said, voice tight but unwavering. Every second counts. Adjusting now, her hands moved with speed and precision, countering the violent shakes, guiding the plane through turbulence, compensating for failing systems, every move a testament to skill honed over years, instincts sharpened through experience and intuition. The passengers felt the change immediately. The violent shaking lessened slightly as Falcon executed the delicate adjustments. Oxygen masks swayed, but the plane no longer pitched uncontrollably. The engines groaned, but the smoke and sparks began to lessen. Her voice came over the intercom again, calm but urgent. We are stabilizing. Keep your belts fastened. We're not out of danger yet, but survival is possible. Trust me. Harris finally exhaled, realizing they had gained some control. She's doing it, he whispered. Daniels nodded, still gripping the panel. I can't believe it. We're actually holding. Falcon didn't relax. She knew the plane was fragile, every system stretched to its limits, and the sabotage wasn't over. It had left lingering chaos in the instruments. Then came the most critical moment. She spotted a clear corridor in the clouds below, a narrow window to execute a controlled descent and emergency landing. Her mind calculated glide ratios, remaining engine thrust, wind resistance, turbulence, patterns, all in fractions of a second. She adjusted the throttles, guided the plane into the corridor, and slowly descended. The cabin shuddered less with each passing second. The passengers, sensing the relative stability, began to breathe a little easier, though fear still gripped them. Just as Falcon was guiding the plane into the safest patch of sky, another alarm blared. This time, it wasn't mechanical, it was a signal she hadn't expected. She realized instantly the interference wasn't a malfunction. It had been deliberate, a remote attempt to take control of the aircraft's navigation. Her jaw tightened. Someone had tried to hijack the plane digitally, to make a disaster inevitable. Her mind raced, but she stayed calm. She had anticipated this possibility. Switching systems manually, overriding the commands, she locked out the sabotage. The plane's systems blinked back into her control. The cabin was tense, silent except for Falcon's voice and the hum of the plane. "We're back under control," she said, voice steady. "Prepare for emergency descent. Remain calm." The passengers clutched each other, but hope flickered. They realized that the young pilot, the girl who had once been laughed at for calling herself Falcon, had taken the impossible and made it survivable. The descent was slow, careful, precise. Falcon guided the plane over the last patch of turbulence, past storm clouds, and toward a faint strip of land visible below. Sparks still flew from the engines, but the fuselage was holding. Every passenger's heart pounded as the ground approached. And then, just as the wheels touched down with a shuddering jolt, a collective gasp filled the cabin. Falcon had done it. The plane was on the ground. Everyone was alive. Harris and Daniels collapsed into their seats, exhausted but awed. She saved us all," Harris whispered. Daniels nodded, unable to speak. The passengers erupted in relief and quiet applause, tears streaming freely. Some hugged each other, some whispered prayers of thanks. The journalist began recording again, capturing Falcon's composed face, sweat on her brow, eyes still sharp, hands steady even after the impossible task she had just accomplished. And then came the final twist. Falcon removed her headset, and her eyes locked with the control towers on the radio. A faint smile touched her lips. "You won't believe this," she said quietly. Harris leaned closer. "What is it?" Falcon gestured to the systems, the instruments, now stabilized and free from interference. "The sabotage wasn't external?" Her voice dropped lower, almost to herself. "It came from within. Someone on board had access. Someone who knew exactly what to do. Until I took control." A shiver ran through the cockpit. Daniels glanced at her, confused. "You mean, one of the passengers?" Falcon nodded slightly, eyes never leaving the now stable instruments. "Yes. Someone placed it, maybe tested it, but they didn't expect me." Harris's eyes widened. The room was silent. Outside, the sun began to break through the clouds, but inside the plane, the realization sank in. They had survived. Yes, but the danger wasn't entirely gone. The threat had been closer than anyone imagined, hidden among them. Falcon leaned back, letting out a long breath. The passengers looked at her with awe, gratitude, and a growing sense of disbelief. The engines were still smoking, the tails still trembling slightly, but the immediate disaster had been avoided. And yet, the final revelation. Someone among them had tried to sabotage the flight hung over the cabin like a shadow. It meant the story wasn't finished. Survival had been achieved, but the true mystery, the identity and motive of the saboteur remained unresolved. In that tense silence, the young pilot named Falcon sat in the cockpit, a quiet guardian of everyone aboard, aware that while they had survived the storm, the world beyond the cabin doors might hold dangers just as unexpected, just as impossible. And as the passengers slowly began to process the relief of survival, one thought lingered in every mind. The flight was over, but the story of Falcon and the hidden hand that had tried to turn disaster into reality was far from finished. The plane sat on the tarmac, still trembling slightly from the turbulence, engines smoldering faintly, but stable. Outside, emergency crews swarmed the runway, flashing lights cutting through the dark clouds that had been so merciless minutes ago. Inside, the cabin was silent for a moment. A collective breath held as passengers slowly realized what had just happened. They had survived a situation that had seemed impossible. Falcon loosened her grip on the controls, her hands trembling slightly, though her expression remained calm. She exhaled slowly, letting herself finally feel the weight of what had just passed. Harris and Daniels leaned back, still pale, their faces a mix of awe and exhaustion. The young co-pilot broke the silence first, voice hoarse. I can't believe we made it. I've flown thousands of hours. Never thought I'd see anything like that." Harris nodded, still staring at Falcon with wide eyes. She didn't just fly the plane. She held everyone's life in her hands and didn't flinch once. The passengers began to move cautiously, peering out of the windows at the runway lights, at the emergency crews approaching. Some started whispering prayers of gratitude, some hugged strangers, others simply sat frozen, trying to process the whirlwind of fear and relief. In one corner, the young journalist began recording again, her hands shaking with adrenaline. This will change everything," she whispered under her breath. "People won't believe a 12-year-old did this, but I saw it." Falcon finally rose from her seat, taking a deep breath and straightening her posture. She had been calm throughout the crisis, but exhaustion ran through her muscles, every nerve on edge. She walked down the aisle slowly, allowing passengers to see her, to acknowledge her presence. Some clapped softly, Some reached out to thank her. One woman pressed her hand to her chest, tears streaming. "You saved us," she said quietly. Vulcan nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. She didn't need the praise. The fact that everyone had survived was enough. Meanwhile, the crew began checking systems, ensuring the engines and tail were stable enough for full shutdown. Harris stayed close to Falcon, watching her work with quiet reverence. "I still don't understand how you managed it," he said, shaking his head. "The engines, the tail, the interference, I don't think anyone else could have done this." Falcon shrugged lightly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "I had you too, and the plane, you just have to listen." Daniels finally spoke, voice almost a whisper. "Listen to the plane." Falcon nodded. "Every aircraft has a rhythm. You just have to feel it, understand it, trust it. And sometimes you have to trust yourself more than the instruments." Daniels exhaled, slowly letting the tension leave his body. "I guess I just never thought instinct could override experience like that." Falcon's eyes softened. "Experience teaches you the rules. Instinct teaches you when to break them." Outside, paramedics began checking on passengers, ensuring no one was injured from turbulence or panic. The mother who had clutched her children the entire flight now held them tightly, whispering reassurances and silently thanking Falcon for keeping them alive. The businessman who had worried about insurance and policy now shook hands with strangers around him, gratitude overtaking fear. The journalist recorded interviews, capturing raw, emotional testimonies of survival. Everyone shared one common thread: astonishment at what Falcon had achieved. Yet, even as relief washed over the cabin, questions remained. Who had tampered with the plane's navigation systems? Falcon knew the interference had come from inside the aircraft, someone with knowledge, with access, with intent, but identifying the person in the chaos of the flight was nearly impossible. Harris leaned toward her as they walked through the cabin together. "Do you think we'll ever know who did it?" he asked quietly. Falcon's gaze flicked toward the passengers. "Thoughtful. Maybe," she said slowly. "But whoever it was, they didn't win. That's what matters. Survival matters more than answers right now." The emergency crews guided the passengers off the plane safely. Falcon stayed near the cockpit, ensuring that the engines were fully shut down and the aircraft secure. Passengers filed past her, some offering hesitant smiles, some lingering to whisper thanks. Even those who had doubted her abilities earlier could no longer deny the truth. This girl, called Falcon, had defied every expectation and saved them all. In the aftermath, reporters gathered around, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Can you tell us how you did it?" one asked. Falcon looked toward the crowd, eyes steady, voice calm. "It wasn't about doing it alone," she said. "It was about focus, preparation, and trusting what you know works. The plane, the crew, and the people on board. We survived together." Her words resonated far beyond the immediate chaos. A lesson in teamwork, courage, and trust under pressure. The journalists recorded her calmly stepping aside, letting the crew and passengers be checked and helped. The mother of the young boy whispered to Falcon, "You're a hero." "I don't know how else to say it." Falcon smiled faintly. "I'm just Falcon," she said, soft but confident. The words, simple as they were, carried the weight of someone who had faced unimaginable danger and come through alive. Yet the final twist lingered in the back of her mind. Someone had attempted sabotage, and that someone had been among the passengers, quietly hidden, watching as she took control. She knew that while they had survived, the mystery had not been fully solved. Whoever it was, it had been outmaneuvered, but the knowledge that a threat had been inside the cabin all along stayed with her. It was a shadow on an otherwise victorious day. The control tower finally made contact. "Falcon, you've handled this better than anyone could have imagined. We've tracked the interference, you neutralized it perfectly. You've prevented a disaster." Falcon nodded, exhaling slowly. "Thank you. Everyone is safe. That's what matters." Harris and Daniels watched from behind, knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As the passengers were escorted away, the journalist approached Falcon one last time. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked. Falcon thought for a moment, eyes on the runway lights fading into the night. "Of course," she said. "Fear is what keeps you alive. It's what makes you focus. But fear isn't the enemy, it's what you do with it that counts." The journalist nodded, capturing the words with her camera, knowing they would echo far beyond the airport, far beyond the story of this single flight. Falcon stepped outside finally, the cool night air hitting her face. Emergency crews and passengers moved around her, some laughing softly, some still silent with shock. The sky was clearing slightly, clouds drifting away to reveal stars peeking through. She took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion settle in, but also a quiet pride. She had survived, yes, but she had also proven something to herself and everyone else. Courage and skill, combined with focus and trust, could accomplish the impossible. Harris finally approached her, voice low and sincere. "You've changed everything today," he said. "I don't think anyone's ever flown a plane like that under those conditions. Ever." Falcon smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I didn't change anything. I just did what I had to do. And we all did it together." The humility in her voice only strengthened the awe around her. As the passengers dispersed into the night, many still speaking of what they had witnessed, Falcon lingered, eyes scanning the runway and the distant horizon. She knew that while the immediate crisis was over, life had a way of throwing new challenges at people, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden. The sabotage incident remained unresolved, a subtle reminder that danger could come from unexpected places. But she also knew one truth above all: she had the strength, the skill, and the courage to face whatever came next. The journalist walked alongside her, notebook full, camera still recording. "What's next for you?" she asked. Falcon considered it, a small smile playing at her lips. "Next I fly. I learn, and I help others survive what I just did. That's all." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience far beyond her years. She had earned the title Falcon, not because of age or reputation, but because she had proven herself when it mattered most. The runway lights blinked in the distance, and Falcon finally allowed herself a small, quiet moment of relief. Around her the world moved again, the passengers talking softly, crews working efficiently, the night sky stretching endlessly. But within her, a calm determination remained. She had faced the impossible, faced chaos, fear, sabotage, and mechanical failure, and emerged with lives saved and a story no one would ever forget. And as she walked toward the small vehicle that would escort her from the aircraft,